170 years ago in 1843, two young boys aged 14 and 16 jumped ship at Fowlers Bay and made their way down the west coast of Eyres Peninsula.
There was Richard Harris, and he was later known as Sam Harris, and George Cummings, and he was known as Joseph Cummings. And they jumped ship at Fowlers Bay, and by jumping ship, we don't know whether they jumped off the ship or they jumped out of the whaling station.
Kay O'Brien is the descendant of Sam Harris. Sam was American and Joseph Cummings was British. Ian Rogers is also a descendant of Sam Harris and says it must have been a tough life for the two young boys.
Well, I think it'd be a pretty terrible sort of a life. I've read a bit about the whaling industry in America, and the ships were rotten old ships. They were very poorly provisioned. There was pretty rough types of blokes on the ship, running away from their wives, criminals. Some have been virtually kidnapped to go on the ships, and it wouldn't have been much of a life at all for young boys. And, you know, the discipline would be pretty strict. I reckon you'd get a flogging for next to nothing in those days. Yeah, it would have been a tough life. I guess they both went whaling, run away to sea looking for adventure. Well, they certainly found it. And we don't know, but I think the winter whaling season ended, shore-based whaling season ended about August, and the boat was going elsewhere, perhaps back to Hobart, because Hobart was a major base for American whalers. There was a huge number of American whaling ships in Hobart, and they may have, you know, thought, well, let's try something different. And we don't know. See, my grandmother may have known, but she didn't tell anyone, and this is how history gets lost so easy. People don't hand it down or write it down, and the next thing you know, it's lost.
That's one of the things these two young boys did, though, isn't it? They actually made a written account of their adventure, we might call it these days, and that's how we know about them. This was published in the Register, which is the newspaper in South Australia, now the Advertiser, and that's how you know about your family.
Yeah, that's true. The only two real written reports we got, Sam, my great-grandfather, was interviewed by the editor of the Register, and Joseph Cummings was interviewed by a resident magistrate, this Matthew Smith, here in Port Lincoln, and that's how they got the written account, and those written accounts were sent back to England in the Geographical Society of England, published in their magazine. And I'm told in those times, if there was reports in England of land to be had in Australia, it caused a lot of interest, because being small and overcrowded, there'd be a lot of Englishmen who'd think, well, let's get out there and try and get a bit of it.
They decided to take with them 10 days provisions and follow the coast.
So they had a bit of a plan.
They must have had a plan, yes. They followed the coast and they called in at another whaling station at Port Collinson. They call that the Streaky Bay whaling station. Once they got to Mount Wedge, they were impressed with the country around Mount Wedge and had grass up to their knees and pools of water, and were very impressed. They then made their way southwards and somehow ended up at Point Drummond, where they caught a survey ship, and that survey ship was called Governor Gawler, and that ship took them on to Port Lincoln, where they were arrested for being illegal immigrants. But because of the information they gave, they were pardoned, and Charles Stark was commissioned to go out and check out their story, and he verified what they had seen, and it opened up the west coast.
Okay, you mentioned that they set off with some supplies, but would they have had enough food to last them over the distance of this journey?
I don't believe so. They say that they saw ducks on the water ponds and had hope of catching a kangaroo, and it wasn't until after they left Mount Wedge that they said they caught a big brown kangaroo and they roasted it, and it managed to last them till they got to Point Drummond, which we think could be 10 to 14 days away. So I can't imagine it would have been very nice.
How do you think it would have felt for these two young lads back at that time to be here in a strange place, finding their way? What would have it felt like?
I really can't imagine what would have gone through their head. I have a 16-year-old grandson, and I would be horrified to think he was going on a whaling boat, let alone setting off into some country where it was not habited by people. And yes, a real worry, I would have thought.
In these accounts that the boys wrote and were published and sent back to England, as you say, they also prompted the exploration by dark.
That's true. Well, this is why we consider it to be significant to EP's history. One newspaper report, they said Cummings was a reliable witness, but Harris, or his real name was Sam Phones, he changed his name, was a rather silent man, and he would only answer when asked a question. And Jim Cronin, another descendant, he travelled to America, the late Jim Cronin, met a lot of the family over there, and he found them all to be the same. You had to really drag the info out of them, and my grandmother definitely was, because a letter arrived home during World War II, before I was born, from a rally in America, and Dad said, "This woman's mistaken, we were Harris, not Phones." And Grandma said, "Oh yeah, well Dad did change his name. She'd kept it under her hat all those years." I don't think they got as much out of Harris as they did out of Cummings, but the reports did agree. They would have known of Port Lincoln, may have even called in here on the way from Hobart. And at one stage they went inland to Mount Cooper and Mount Wedge, and at one stage they thought they better get back on the coast in case they lost themselves in the interior, and they basically followed Edward John Eyres' track, who was the first white man to travel from SA to WA. I think they must have had a bit of knowledge of navigation, because where they put Mount Wedge turned out to be later to be more accurate than where Eyres said it was. You know, the country would be new to them. They took some provisions with them, but one report said they got a big roux at one stage, and that lasted them for a while. They must have been able to light a fire, and they had water kegs with them. Well, they wouldn't be very big, you wouldn't be able to carry them, but it was August of a wet year. They spoke about water laying near Mount Wedge, and I reckon if it had been in dry year or summer, they would have died of thirst for sure. They both went to Adelaide. Joseph Cummings worked, as far as his family knows, as a guide, guiding people up into the Adelaide Hills and showing them the country there. Sam worked for the Surveyor General in Adelaide. They both married over there and came back to Port Lincoln, and this is quite a few years later. In 1880, Sam got land at Pine Hut out from Sheringa, and Joseph got an adjoining run called Black Hill, pastoral runs. They were running sheep up there for a number of years and sort of pioneers of the Sheringa district.
On the October long weekend, descendants of Sam Harris and Joseph Cummings are going to trek along the route that Harris and Cummings took down the west coast from Fowlers Bay to Point Drummond.
Basically, we're just going to follow their footsteps and go where we know they went. We don't know much, but we'll go where we know they went. We decided we'd just do a 2-day car trip, stopping at Elliston the first day, calling in at the Sheringa Cemetery where Joseph Cummings and his wife are buried, and my great-grandmother is buried. Sam went back to America, died back there. We don't know why. There's a lot of mystery. Things we don't know about him. And we'll go to Pine Hut and Black Hill where they were living, finish up at Point Drummond and unveil, hopefully if these plaques arrive, we'll unveil some plaques. And bit of a celebration we get there, and that's it.
This was back in 1843, so it's, 170 years?
Yeah, 170 years. So we thought, seeing it's 170 years, we'll mark it this way and sort of perhaps establish their place in history a bit, because through them sending Dark up to explore the country, it was pretty significant to EP's history. You know, I don't know how they survived, but they did, so lucky we're here, really.